Hello, and welcome to a special edition of SpectrumCast. With the evolution of data centers these days, the way we create and capture data is ever-changing. In addition, the number of people that need access to data in order to get their job done is increasing. Combine all of these factors, along with data growth, it's putting a strain on not only how your infrastructure is architected, but also how your backup is architected. Today's backup is responsible for operational recovery, data reuse, disaster recovery, and cyber resiliency. The big question is your environment set up to properly help your customers, the end user, be successful, and your company be both protected and get up and running in the event of any issue? Today we have assembled a cast of industry data protection subject matter experts to help introduce a new Vodcast we will be doing to talk about these issues and how to make sure your backup environment is as robust as it can be. Welcome back again, everybody, to this edition of SpectrumCast. I'm here with my colleague, Randy Arseneau, and we are here with Sean and Tricia. Welcome back. Today, we are going to have a pretty fruitful conversation around, as the data center continues to evolve, things we saw 5 to 10 years ago are really rapidly changing to today. And one of those main things that we always talk about, and I think it's pretty much a requirement to have in every product slide that every vendor in the storage industry does, is that chart that tends to go up and to the right with data growth. I don't think any of us are immune to what's going on there. But it does beg the question to think about, as data continues to grow, does that force a reconsideration to re-architect how you back that information up? So let's start with our friend Sean. And Sean, why don't you give us some information about how the change of the data center with data growth is causing folks to rethink how they back up information?
Well, I mean, in many cases, the amount of that data is making it virtually impossible to do a backup, right? Because the scale of this data is just huge. Now, usually when I see that chart, I kind of see it broken into structured data versus unstructured data, right? Structured data being the type of data that's in databases and is searchable and at least used to be considered mission critical, is mission critical, really. And the unstructured data, which is more along the lines of kind of everything else, right? We're talking, videos, movies, pictures, documents, audio, those types of things. A lot of that has really been facilitated by object storage, right? When object storage came onto the scene, it kind of allowed that scale of growth to exist and kind of put us in the position of, well, now we have to figure some way to back this up.
Tricia, what's your philosophy? A lot of clients, or a lot of I think people who sell data protection software say you have to back everything up. Is that necessarily the case?
I don't think that's necessarily the case, because not all data has the same value. And I think it really comes down to, what do you need to be able to restore, first of all, for value of it, second of all, maybe for data retention requirements, but third, if there is a disaster recovery, what are the pieces we need to be able to get back and get back most rapidly? And that's where you're going to start narrowing down what's being backed up, how it's being backed up, what type of storage is being stored on, and are you using things like space management, where you're moving it off of your production servers so that if there is a restore, you're just restoring a small subfile instead of having to restore the entire file in a disaster.
Yeah, so there's all the different data types. And Randy, we're working heavily on the other side of the equation, how the data gets created between traditional systems, virtual systems, container systems, and that's becoming more of a topic these days.
Well, and tying it together with what you said off the top, I mean, as data does continue to grow, and certainly unstructured data, the lion's share of it's within that realm, it becomes increasingly challenging. I mean, back in the day, you could spin a backup, once an hour of your entire production instance and all of your production, critical working sets, and now that's not really practical to do anymore. I mean, I hear I hear you guys often say, you know, how do you back up a petabyte of data? The answer is you don't, because there's really no practical way to do it. So, I mean, I think about backing up my media library on my PC with all my video and multimedia assets and stuff. I push it up to Backblaze, which is like an online backup provider. If I had to restore that, they're at the point now where they will physically ship me a hard drive, because it would take like a week to restore it on the cloud via the ingests and outflow. So it does introduce a whole bunch of challenges, and I know that our portfolio's evolved to kind of overcome some of those challenges, but it does still require some architectural best practices that, you know, you guys are the subject matter experts much more so than I. So
I think one area we didn't touch on is, where is that data sitting on? Yes, there's different types of data, but is it sitting on something like Scale, or is it sitting out on a NAS device? Because that's also going to impact how we can back it up, or the options that are available out there.
We've talked a lot about, you know, kind of the processes and a lot of the things that are creating the data growth. Let's dive into the technology a little bit from the standpoint of, I think all three of us, or all four of us, have said a little something around a topic that I really like to talk about, that I started talking about as an analyst over a decade ago when covering the data protection space. And that was, if clients don't start classifying their data, right? So we talked about, do you have to back it all up? Sean talked about database data, file system data, or object data. We were talking about different types of the way data was created, right? All of that data, each one of those segments of data has different value to the client. And Tricia, to your last point, right? If I better understand my value, right, then I can choose a set of processes to back up the most important stuff first, next most important stuff second, et cetera, down the line, to get the most rapidly functioning needs of the business up and running as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I mean, that's, you know, I think that's, it's certainly good advice, right? But it's one, when I talk to customers, that a lot of them fail to do, simply because of the labor involved in doing it, right? You know, there are many automated tools out there that kind of do things like that. Many of tools in our data protection products and some of the data storage suites that do things like that. But, you know, a lot of it, unfortunately, comes down to manual labor, right? Doing disaster recovery planning and doing the kind of labor-intensive hard work where you just know which your critical data is and which ones isn't. And, you know, a lot of people just don't have the manpower to invest in things like that.
But at what point, and anyone can answer, at what point does that break, right? In other words, 10 years ago, I was preaching to the choir saying we need to do this. Now we're at this point, Randy, what you just said, you're at this petabyte of capacity. You really can't do it. Now, maybe you can back it up, right? The incremental forever and the small segments. And of course, you weren't backing up a petabyte right away. So today with things like Protect that does incrementals, okay, so maybe I can do it. But I can't recover it. To your point, I got to ship you the drive. So at what point, from a recovery standpoint, does it break if I don't know what I need to do first?
And I think the first thing there is understanding that your recovery might not just be using one solution. It might be, for instance, snapping back a snapshot that was taken via hardware, like Spectrum Protect for snapshots or copy data management, and then bringing back on top of that an incremental backup with the changes that might have happened more recently if it was a disaster, versus if all I need to do is bring back one file, that incremental forever is going to suffice. So I think it's also looking at the different tools available and the different scenarios where I'm going to have to restore it in. And that pulls back to the planning aspect of what are the possibilities of what can go wrong.
Sorry, just that raises an interesting point, and I was actually going to ask about this. So the introduction of things like CDM and some of these additional capabilities that enhance the reuse of the data, so ways to derive more value from secondary and tertiary copies of the data, which, whether it's supporting multiple test environments or providing digital supply chain data to outside sources or whatever, that itself also then, while it improves efficiency, also puts some new demands and requirements on data protection. And I know that that's something that I hear a lot when I talk to clients is if we're going to make this investment and we're going to kind of re-engineer and reimagine the way we protect the data and the way we do DR, let's make sure we're getting some of these ancillary benefits too, right? So that's kind of one of the ways to help justify that that refactoring.
Yeah, it brings up an interesting question, right? So we often say we have 3 products in our data protection portfolio: Spectrum Protect, Protect Plus, and Spectrum CDM. We've also been talking about the fact that there's protection. Tricia, I think you talked about this need around instant recovery, or what I call operational recovery. Get the business running while I go figure out what I need to do to make sure that either doesn't happen again or whatnot. There's the archive. There's the long-term retention for compliance needs. And then there's disaster recovery, and you could argue cyber resiliency, but I consider a cyber attack a disaster. So, I mean, at the end of the day, I kind of lump those two together. Is it necessarily wrong to have multiple solutions helping fulfill the gamut of that set of recovery requirements?
No, and I would add to that the space management, because you do get these large data sources. Maybe it's surveillance cameras, maybe it's media files, maybe it's blueprints. And these, maybe it's x-rays, these have to be local and on machines. But by keeping files local, the disaster, the backup, everything slows down. So if you can add to that the concept of migrating them and leaving a step file, that can be added to the slew of restore and backup options and how to expedite both of those.
Sean, when you're talking to clients, are you hearing the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think to answer your question, Steve, you know, is it wrong to have multiple tools and multiple strategies? I think the answer is the truth is somewhere in the middle, right? I mean, I've seen both extremes, right? I've been a part of the tools studies where we've gone out to customers and found that they have 500 different tools to do the same thing, and they're trying to consolidate down to some reasonable number. And I've seen ones that have pounded their fist on the desk and said, you know, we're going to this one, and like, you know, these other 10 are out, right? And the truth is somewhere in the middle. You know, there are certain situations in many environments that call for different tools and different methodologies and different levels of protection. And I think that's okay as long as you don't go overboard with those types of things.
So I have sorry, Tricia, just I've kind of maybe an oddball question or slightly off topic question, but what are the implications in all of this for metadata? The ability to effectively manage, enhance, you know, ingest and otherwise curate metadata. I mean, I assume it puts a lot of pressure on that as well, right?
And this was actually what I was just going to say is, if you have a good management tool with a lot of metadata like Spectrum Protect, we can actually do a lot more data reuse. So maybe I originally sent that file as a backup, but now I can, just by altering the metadata, I can also turn it into a retention. I can also utilize it in a bare metal restore scenario. And I can link it in with my space management. And so the metadata becomes critical in being able to smartly manage it and not have to constantly re-back it up or re-archive it or re-space manage it.
I think we do a lot, and I often talk about this as a value of the IBM portfolio. When we think about internally building the solution between Protect Plus and CDM, how are we merging them together? Because I would agree with you, Sean. There are a number of companies that maybe they were using, I always call it the Gartner's Big Five back in, you know, a decade ago. It was Veritas, HP, Networker, and TSM, right? Now we have a whole bunch of newcomers, right? We've got Veeam, we've got Rubrik, we've got Cohesity, right? So as that transition took place, because there weren't a lot of complementary tools, let's say at the time, clients said, okay, I'm going to stick with TSM here, which is now Protect, right? But now for my virtual environment, I'm going to do this. And now we're moving into containers. I'm going to go and pick this, right? And so one of the things we're trying really hard to do is make sure that they talk to each other. So maybe they solve different problems. So maybe they're different tools, but what can we do to bring commonality among them to make, I think, you know, Sean, when folks would pound the desk and say, I want one tool, it was more from a simplicity of management.
The labor involved in this
management, it's the simplicity of being able to reuse the same back-end resources, the same storage, getting better DJ breaks because you're sending everything to that. So building on the simplicity of management is the simplicity of managing your hardware infrastructure behind that and getting the most out of that.
Yeah, and I think any place where you can provide commonality, both of what you're writing to saves times because it's common dedupe, as you were saying, Tricia. You can save space, right? There are all those things that come into play in order to try to protect it. So I think we've really outlined the fact that in today's day and age, you really need to have a new way of architecting your infrastructure, and you need to really think about that. It's not just making an investment because the vendor says, okay, hey, buy my stuff because it's newer, it's cooler, it's faster, it's whatever. There's a whole line of questions in a consultative kind of environment that you want to be thinking about when it comes to building out that new infrastructure, including what's my recovery speed, what data needs to be recovered faster, the metadata component, right? How does that help me? The data reuse piece, which is becoming more and more important, because if I'm a client and I'm making multiple copies of data, but I haven't segmented that out and I don't know what's a copy and what's original, and I back that up yet again, right? I'm just compounding my problem, right?
Yeah, you get backup sprawl, right? Well, and it seems like a lot of the additional capabilities that we've been talking about, whether it's reuse or efficiency or higher levels of protection and shorter, our RPOs and RTOs drive potentially more complex designs, right? So you've got to do this much more consultative kind of discussion. So whereas before, to your point, you just said, okay, it's this big, we need this much space, done. You do your full backups on a nightly basis, and occasionally spin it off to tape and send it to Iron Mountain and you're done. So now it's become a lot more nuanced, right? So it gives opportunity for uncertainty, but also for more capabilities and more advanced features.
I worry about data sprawl when we take into consideration the cloud, and Randy, you alluded to this, talking about backing up all your things to the cloud, is suddenly that's an infinite amount of space out there. So if I keep pushing my backups and everything out there, suddenly I'm not really even conscious of, wow, how long would this take me to restore? How much will I have to pay to restore it? Because a lot of times the public clouds, the get rates are a lot higher than the put rates.
And Randy,
yeah, they definitely.
You highlighted a nice thought, which is the use of tape. So now all of a sudden we've brought into, and you actually phrase it as, then I'm going to spin it off to tape. So the question then becomes, right, you'll hear multiple studies say you want to have 3 copies of your data, right? The one you're going to recover from, maybe the offsite copy in case of a disaster, right? Leveraging tape. Now we're thinking about the back end, right? So tape, immutable storage, is it just traditional storage? Is it BTL? There's a whole gamut that you also need to add into this mixture of architecture to say, what am I protecting against, right? When we talk about cyber, right? Maybe you find that the ransomware attack happened instantly and you can recover from a snapshot, no problem, right? Maybe that ransom attack lay dormant for 200 days and you have to go all the way back to tape because you probably don't have 200 days worth of snapshots. Sean, are you seeing folks have multiple back-end targets for their backups?
Oh, absolutely. And maybe the cyber attack is targeting your snapshots, right? Because the cyber criminals are getting increasingly sophisticated and understand this infrastructure and literally how to disable not only your primary copy, but potentially also your backend copy. Right?
Yeah, that is big for the cyber criminals these days, going after the
Well,
backup copy.
Yeah, and I think that raises an interesting, differentiator. So if you're talking to clients or partners or industry folks, I think we as IBM, given the breadth and depth of our portfolio, are kind of uniquely positioned to offer solutions to all of these issues. Kind of whether it's at the the gathering and ingest phase, or whether it's at the recovery phase, or whether it's as the underpinning of an overall cybersecurity strategy or cyber, incident detection and prevention security metaphor. I think we have solutions across the board, and that's just within systems. And then if you look outside at the security team and the software team and the cloud team, I mean, you can make a pretty compelling case that nobody else comes close to offering the portfolio of services and capabilities that we can bring to bear.
Even a step further back, looking at the hardware, am I putting this on, like, for instance, a scale GPFS file system that's tightly integrated with Spectrum Protect, where I can do those rapid backups, even of those large file systems, and add in SOBAR for disaster recovery and things like that. So even one step further back.
Great. So just want to pass it around the room. Sean, any last words you want to, parting words you want to give to our clients or sellers to think about when thinking about data protection?
No, I mean, this is a complex subject, right? And architecting these environments is a complex thing, right? And I think this is, as we just said, I think this is an area where IBM can uniquely help, because we can not only assist with the technology and the tools, but also the processes involved in getting these things in order and putting them in place and coming up with the best solution to meet your needs.
Randy, any parting thoughts?
Yeah, I would just echo that. I mean, I think this is an opportunity for us as we're having these conversations to emphasize that the breadth and depth of capabilities and portfolio solutions that we can bring to bear, and not just for the giant, global enterprises, but even for the smaller, the smaller implementations, more the departmental or kind of mom and pop shop level. We've got a solution for everyone.
And I would just add to that, we talk about backup, but it's really about restore. And like anything, you got to practice that restore. You need to be doing VR scenarios. You need to be thinking out of the box of how things can go wrong so that you're covering those.
Well, I want to thank you all today for this conversation. I mean, this is, as Sean said, we could go on for days about this particular topic. As data continues to grow and the tools continue to get, there's over 100 backup technologies in the marketplace. There's a bunch of different business problems you're trying to solve, from operational recovery to cyber resiliency. You need to take into account a lot of different moving parts. And I think our advice back is to just sit down, think about these things, and kind of map them out as you start to think about architecting or re-architecting your modern data protection strategy. So I want to thank everyone for showing up, and join us again next week, and we'll have a new topic. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.